for joining this presentation. Thank you all for joining this presentation. Let me start out by explaining a couple of things. I am neurodivergent. So that means I have a couple of things that are very difficult. I don't read very well, even though I'm an educator. So in this presentation, you're going to see some mistakes and you're going to hear some mistakes. That's what it means to be neurodivergent. And so you're going to just have to live with those issues. I don't do the regular slide presentation. I keep my slides on the side because I need to see them. And I'm going to be moving fast because I have a lot. I have a lot of slides, so I want to try to get through all of them. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, but give you what it means to be a neurodivergent educator in a neurotypical world, and what happens when a neurodivergent educator impacts a neurotypical environment. I have several neurodivergent issues. I am dyslexic, dyscalculia, dysgraphic, and dyspraxia, but I'm going to focus on dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is a physical and emotional learning disability. It causes what we call adverse childhood experiences. We're going to focus on that a little bit later. So again, I'm going to be moving quickly because I have almost 70 slides. When I was in third grade, I enjoyed third grade so much, I was forced to repeat it. When I was in fifth grade, my math teacher thought I was playing in class, so she made me stand up against a wall while she taught the other kids math. When I was in sixth grade, I was punished for not being able to read the book, Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill, and they took me out of class and made me go sit in another classroom. When I was 12, my little niece, I was trying to read a book to her. She told me, "You can't read." And I put her off my lap and I went down the street and realized cars were stopping in the middle of the street. And I realized I couldn't read stop on a stop sign. When I was 16, I graduated from 8th grade. It was called promotional graduation. They realized they couldn't keep me in 8th grade anymore. The 8th grade counselor came over and said to my mother and me, "He's too dumb to make it to high school or through high school." In high school, I was put in a special class because they realized I couldn't read and write. It was called OMAT, one major at a time. There were 26 students in that class. Only one of them graduated 4 years later. That was because a teacher, his name was Doc Mosby. He put me up against a wall and he said, "There's something special about you. You're going to graduate." I was almost 20 when I graduated from high school. I didn't learn to 2 years out of high school that I had a neurodiversity. It was too late to do anything about it at that point. These things that happened to me are called an ACE, adverse childhood experience. Kaiser Permanente Hospital, along with the CDC in the 1990s, did a study. They studied their patients. And unfortunately, like all studies between the 1800s and 2000s, they typically studied white males. They found that all of their patients had at least one ACE study, one ACE score, one adverse childhood experience. I put a lot of resources, I've given Amber a lot of resources that you will get. One of those resources is that very study. You will be able to take it yourself and you'll be able to see if you have an ACE score. On the back of that test is called a resource score. It's how you recover from it. We're going to talk about that a little later as well. This slide came from a suggestion somebody gave me. It's blank or black because he said you should put pictures of yourself. There are no pictures of me as a child. That caused an adverse childhood experience. There are 0 pictures of my childhood. The only pictures I have of me are in high school. This adverse childhood experience caused trauma. What is trauma? The word trauma comes from the Greek word for wound, physical or psychological wound. The brain will consciously continue to access the portion of traumatic memory or experienced that have not been processed to bring about more adaptive experiences in what is referred to as reprocessing. So the brain will continue to access trauma unless it's dealt with properly. It will access trauma over and over and over again. We call that post-traumatic stress disorder. They didn't understand this until the 1980s, when the Vietnam soldiers were coming back from war, or in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM, they were studying the Vietnam soldiers. Trauma is most likely to occur in individuals who were closely associated with such events, or who witnessed something from a distance. Young children who have developed fewer coping mechanisms than adults are especially vulnerable to traumatic events. So that's trauma-related disorders. Short-term reactions, shock, denial, flashback, unpredictable mood swings, difficulty in forming and maintaining relationships, headache, nausea. These are all signs and symptoms of trauma. And kids are really susceptible to traumatic incidents. Trauma lives in the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the most evolved portion of the brain. It controls higher order thinking skills, reason, and speech. We're going to be talking a lot about the frontal lobe. Executive function refers to a group of brain skills that direct and organize our behavior. Frontal lobe executive function is called EFS. We're talking about these portions of the brain. Now, there is some exciting information about trauma and executive functions. This information is so exciting. It's brand new information about this. Like a conductor of the brain, EFS uses a group of skills to make plans, organize, set goals, get started on tasks, carry out goals and plans, strategizes how to accomplish tasks, paying attention, monitoring, and performing, stopping impulses. Executive skills also include processing speed, how quickly we can complete tasks, working memory, how we can hold on to information for short term. Executive function refers to that group of skills that direct it. So executive function is everything. Executive function or cognitive control are higher order cognitive functions needed for adaptive goal-directed behavior and are significantly impaired in the majority of neuropsychic disorders. That's me. So people who have neuropsychic problems like schizophrenia, or people who have disabilities like myself, our executive function has a problem. Traditionally, EFS are commonly described in terms of specific types of information processing: cognitive, processing, or cognitive. So those are the two functions traditionally. It's processing or cognitive. Now we're going to talk about the new and exciting information. So traditionally, they talk about this as you either process it or you think about it. That's the traditional way. Recent emerging, perhaps least controversial organizational principle of EFS distinguish between EFS based on extinct that they are related to emotions. This is what's important now, that the EFS is now related to emotions. It's not just processing or cognitive, that they are related to your emotions. That's brand new information that's not controversial. I'm going to ask you a question, and you guys, since I have so many slides, you can discuss it in the chat with yourself. Then I'm going to explain what a person with a learning disability, what neurodiversity is. So for a second, what do you guys see? In these pictures, what do you all see? Most people see two images. Some people have the pleasure of seeing three images in these pictures. In this picture, some people see two images. In this picture, some people see two images. I only see a young lady. I do not see two images. I only see the young lady in all three images. That's neurodiversity. I only see a horse. Apparently, some of you see a horse and a frog. That absolutely drives me crazy. How you see a frog drives me out of my mind. But apparently, some people see a frog. How you see a horse in this is insane to me. It's just insane. I only see a frog. So apparently, some of you see a horse. Now, what's next, I call the Mr. Spock paradox. For those of you who watch Star Trek, Mr. Spock is called a Vulcan, and he has a problem between his emotional side of his brain and his cognitive side of his brain. I'm going to play this little clip.
You're a mean one, Mr. Spock. You really are the heel. You're as cuddly as a Klingon. You're as charming as an eel, Mr. Spock.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
You're inhuman, Mr. Spock. Your heart's an empty hole. Your brain is a computer. You've got logic in your soul, Mr. Spock.
But my internal arrangement differs from yours, Doctor. Pleases me no end.
You're cold-blooded, Mr. Spock.
Why, thank you, Doctor.
Assuming you call that stuff blood. You have all the personality of a routine gaseous cloud, Mr. Spock.
Dr. McCoy, I believe you're enjoying all this.
Indeed, Captain. I've never seen him look so happy.
Shut up! Well, what do you know? I finally got the last word.
Mr. Spock struggled with the two sides of his brain. He struggled with the hot side of his brain and the cold side of his brain. That's the new thinking, that in that frontal lobe, we have a cognitive hot side of our brain, or we have a hot side of our brain and a cold side of our brain. Hot and cold executive functions in the brain and the prefrontal cortex. That's what we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. Traditionally, the concept of EFS was closely related to the distinction between two types of information: processing, automatic versus controlled. They know this because they can see the brain light up. Now we know there's a hot side and there's a cold side, or vertical thinking versus lateral horizontal thinking. Hot EFS involves processing of information related to reward, emotion, and motivation. So the hot side is about rewards and motivation. Lateral thinking takes a creative and indirect approach to problem solving. Vertical thinking is more linear. It uses to solve well-defined problems that require a systematic and logical approach. Cold EFS, vertical thinkers involve purely cognitive processing. Cold EFS are logical-based or mechanical vertical thinkers. Vertical thinkers is more linear. It's used to solve well-defined problems that require a systematic and logical approach. Vertical thinkers involve analyzing information and follow structured path to reach solutions. Assignments must be built sequentially upon one another in meaningful ways to promote knowledge transfer. Cold include working memory, response reserves, attention control, and planning. That's your conscious memory. We all have two sides of this brain, our conscious, our cold memory. It looks like a waterfall. That's the vertical linear thinking. It has scope and sequence to it. Most teachers, most businesses, most people work out of this cold, conscious, linear thinking process. The curriculum and its pedagogy must be made transparent and explicit to students to reinforce knowledge transfer. This is considered a revolutionary concept of the cold linear thinking. Genre analysts must be central focused. Students must write about and or write in a variety of genres beyond the exploratory essay. The curriculum provides reading in a variety of genres. The curriculum emphasizes and teaches metacognitive awareness, including self-reflection, and facilitate high road transfer of knowledge. This is my linear process. This is my vertical thinking. I teach. I'm a part-time guest lecturer at the University of Chicago School of Social Work. And in order to keep my job, I had to come up with this so they could turn it in. This is the scope and sequence. This is the way that they could justify my class. I laid it out for them. And so they could turn it in. This is not how I teach. I'm a horizontal thinker. I'm a divergent thinker. I'm a lateral thinker. The goal is to have the cold side of my brain or the cold side of our brain to communicate better with the hot side of the brain. That's the goal. Hot EFS. Functionally speaking, hot EFS cognitive processing operates significant emotional and motivational gratification with rewards and punishments. Hot EFS are delayed discounting, effective risk decision-making, and interpersonal and social behaviors. Lateral thinking, sometimes called horizontal thinking or divergent thinking, is defined as the approach to problem solving that strives to creative solutions rather than the most straightforward answers. Through spontaneous, free-flowing brainstorming, lateral thinking disrupts traditional step-by-step patterns to develop as many varied creative ideas as possible. Hot or unconscious memories. This is what it would look like. Lateral thinking, the horizontal thinking. Hot EFS involves processing of information related to rewards, emotions, and motivations while cold DFS involves purely cognitive information. I work out of the hot part of my brain, but it's best if they learn how to communicate with one another better. That ACE we talked about earlier, they teach resilience. That was the word I was reaching for earlier. On the other side of that paper, the resources I give you, they have a form for resilience. I don't teach resilience. I teach something else. When my students down, I teach them, I don't care about your grades. I don't care what grade you get in my class. I don't care when you turn in your paper, as long as it's turned in a week before the final grades are due. I know that's revolutionary to some people. I know that's a problem for some people. And they have homework due every week, once a week. One of the things I teach is called recovery capital. It's most done for drug addiction retreatment. But if we teach recovery capital, see, one of the things I'm trying to get across is that we need to learn how to be trauma informed, because students and people we work with come to us traumatized. They come to us with ACE scores. And if we are trauma informed, we can help them recover, teach them that they have recovery capital. And one of the ways to do that is called psychological safety. If we provide them with psychological safety, this is the minimum we can provide, not just students, but people in our workplace, people who understand neurodiversity. They are providing their employees with psychological safety. This is one of the things I provide for my students, is I make sure that they are psychologically safe. How do we do that? This is not just for the students, this is for those in charge. For those in charge have to understand that they need to be inclusive, give people space to talk, that those in charge need to be learners, value honesty over correct answers. I do that all the time. I tell my students, you don't have to turn in the homework this week. You can learn from the discussion, go back, rewrite whatever you're going to do, and then come back and turn it in later. That they have a place to be contributors, encourage equal participation, and that those in charge can be challenged. Do not be afraid of the bad news. My students challenge me all the time, and when they do that, they give me great advice. I get great advice from my students. And when they do that, I'm able to change and adapt and grow. And so that's psychological safety. I have some goals. One of the main goals is stabilization, teaching my students coping skills, affect regulation strategies, and recovery capital. So this project I'm giving you today started out something completely different. It started out, I planned this months ago, and then I taught my class. And I had a student that changed everything. See, one of the big things I teach my students is to be anti-fragile, is not to break when things are so hard. Instead of being resilient and bouncing back, I teach them what it means to be anti-fragile. I also teach something called social location. Where were you born? What family were you born in? How were you treated in that family? What happens in your family? My students have to do a midterm of their social location. This student turned in her social location project. She changed my concept of what it means for a neurodivergent teacher who teaches a neurotypical student who had trauma. I got permission to share this with you.
She'd take the world off my shoulders if it was ever hard to move. She'd turn the rain to a rainbow when I was living in the blue. Why then, if she's so perfect, do I still wish that it was you? Perfect don't mean that it's working, so what can I do when you're outside in my mind? 'Cause sometimes I look in her eyes and that's where I find a glimpse of us. And I try to fall for her touch, but I'm thinking of the way it was. Said I'm fine and said I moved on. I'm only here passing time in her arms, hoping I'll find a glimpse of us. Tell me, save us your glory. Does he laugh the way I did? Is this a part of your story? One that I had never lived? Maybe one day you feel lonely, and in his eyes you'll get a glimpse. Maybe you'll start slipping slowly, find me again when you're outside in my mind. 'Cause sometimes I look in her eyes and that's where I find a glimpse of us. And I try to fall for her touch, but I'm thinking of the way it was. Said I'm fine and said I moved on. I'm only here passing time in her arms, hoping I'll find a glimpse Cause sometimes I look in her eyes and that's where I find a glimpse of us. And I try to fall for her touch, but I'm thinking of the way it was. Said I'm fine and said I moved on. I'm only here passing time in her arms, hoping I'll find a glimpse of us. She'd take the world off my shoulders if it was ever hard to move. She'd turn the rain to a rainbow when I was living in the blue. Why then, if she's so perfect, do I still wish that it was you? Perfect don't mean that it's working, so what can I do when you're outside in my mind? 'Cause sometimes I look in her eyes and that's where I find a glimpse of us. And I try to fall for her touch, but I'm thinking of the way it was. Said I'm fine and said I moved on. I'm only here passing save us your glory? Does he laugh the way I did? Is this a part of your story? One that I had never lived. Maybe one day you feel lonely, and in his eyes you'll get a glimpse. Maybe you'll start slipping slowly, find me alive when you're outside in my mind. 'Cause sometimes I look in her eyes, and that's where I find a glimpse of us. And I try to fall for her touch, but I'm thinking of the way it was. Said I'm fine, and said I moved on. I'm only here passing time in her arms, hoping I'll find a glimpse of us. 'Cause sometimes I look in her eyes, and that's where I find a glimpse of us. And I try to fall for her touch, but I'm thinking of the way it was. Said I'm fine, and said I moved on. I'm only here passing time in her arms, hoping I'll find a glimpse of us.
A young lady took my class by mistake. She speaks 3 languages. English is her 3rd language. I teach something called not just psychological safety, I teach a sacred space. My class is a sacred space. What the new information is that stressors are information. I teach anti-fragility, how to be anti-fragile. When you want deviation and you don't care about the possible dispersal of outcomes that the future can bring, since most will be helpful, then you are anti-fragile. Now the crux of the complex system, those interacting parts, is that to convey information to those component parts through stressors, or thanks to those stressors. Your body gets information about the environment, not through the logical apparatuses or intelligence and ability to reason and compute and calculate, but through stress via hormones or other messages. That's anti-fragile. So what we want to do is take the stressors in our life, instead of having them crush us, use this information as information and let them teach us how to survive them. That's anti-fragile. That's what I teach my students. The errors of some people carry benefits for others. We can simplify the relationship between fragility, error, and anti-fragile as follows. When you are fragile, you depend on the following: the exact planned course with as little deviation as possible, for deviations are more harmful than helpful. This is why the fragile need to be very predictive in its approach. And conversely, predictive systems cause fragility. Using error as a source of information. If every trial provides you with information about what does not work, you start zooming on solutions. So every attempt becomes more valuable, more like an expense than an error. And of course, you make discoveries along the way. Further, the random elements in trial and error is not quite random. It carries out rationally. So we use error as information. All of that is the new information. Now we're going to talk about what I teach. Each one of these slides by itself takes an hour, is an hour's presentation by itself. The first thing I teach, and in my class, I teach these to the students, and some of them, we do it without them even knowing. I teach them sacred space. That I teach them purposely, that my class is a sacred space. We do meditation in my class. Even though it's a class on race and racism, I tell them this is a sacred class at a sacred space. This image, I took it, it's of a tree in South Carolina. The tree is 500 years old. If we have time, I'd like to come back to this. This is a song by India R.E. about sacred space. I teach the second movement. It's called presuppositions and social location. We talked about social location. This concept is absolutely vital. It's called action, reflection, action. What is the current action? Can you reflect on that action? And then can you come up with new actions and then reflect on those new actions? Action, reflection, action is vital in how I teach. Do you experience liminal space? Liminal space, or what they call doorway people or doorway kids. It's been scientifically proven that sometimes people go from one room to the other and they forget what they were doing, or they're doorway kids. Once they leave a classroom and walk out of the hallway, they forget everything they've done. We talk about what liminal spaces are and why those liminal things happen to you. Attachment style. In the resources I've given you, attachment theory and attachment style is vital. That's an entire workshop. I've given you a resource for you to figure out what your attachment style is. I've also given you a resource on how to understand what it means to be trauma informed. There's a website called Nancy, I believe it's Alice. It's called alice.com. It's a free website for you to become trauma informed. So I've given you a whole bunch of resources with this workshop. There's a whole list of resources that can help you out with this workshop on how to become trauma informed. Recognizing patterns. Humans often get stuck. I skipped one, this one. Anchoring focalism bias. Most people get stuck on implicit bias. Implicit bias is wrong. I know that's going to upset some of you. I know people get stuck on implicit bias. People love implicit bias. But the new information shows that implicit bias training doesn't work. Don't be upset with me. The real concept is anchoring focalism bias. What is anchoring focalism bias? Humans often get stuck on anchoring focalism bias, making judgment decisions based on the first piece of information that they receive. Vertical thinkers encourage this bias because it builds on what you already have as a new data and arrives, you stack them on top of the existing information instead of innovating. But lateral thinkers are often more aware of their thought patterns, meaning they can better prevent bias and recognize information. Anchoring focalism bias means you try to prove your point with more information instead of finding new information. Here is what we've talked about so far: being trauma-informed, anti-fragile, psychological safety, recovery capital, the ACE scores, lateral thinking, vertical thinking, hot and cold executive functioning, and stabilization. If we can help people in our workplace, in our schools, and our families become more psychologically stable, we can help people to function better. That's the goal, getting people to be stabilized in their lives so they can carry on in a better place. This is what happened to that student who accidentally took my class and after the first day decided to stay in it. This was a piece of her final. But the best part of this program was that she met a teacher who influenced her soul, Dr. Cobb. In Dr. Cobb's class, the girl learned for the first time that race is pseudoscience, that there is no research that provides that race is a way of distinguishing between good and bad people, and that even the word was coined. This information shocked the girl for a long time, and it was the first time she realized that she was not different. The way he taught his students was very different from other teachers. He respected the diversity of the students' ability to learning style, and provided them with a space to learn with complete equity and respect, which was the first time a girl had ever known that it was possible to be a teacher in such a way. It also reminded her of the rainbow theory that her mother had taught her. Her mother taught her that race wasn't important. There were rainbows, that race was like the rainbow of all different colors. Like I said, I teach my students something called sacred space. This is one of my favorite songs. It lasts 4 minutes. I'd like to play this song and then open it up for questions. And I apologize, I went so fast, but I wanted to get all the slides in. I'd like to play this song now.
You are where I go to hide when the wind starts to blow, when the lightning starts to strike, when the thunder starts to roll, when this life becomes a fight. You are where I put my gloves down when I'm running out of time. You are where I go to slow down. You are my favorite place. You are my sacred space. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Where I go to be moved, where I go to be still. Your love makes me new. In your presence I heal. You are my favorite place. You are my sacred space. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. No walls, no war, no cause, no weapons formed, no law. What for? You are where I go to hide. You are where I go to heal. You are where I go to feel, to remember what is real. Ooh. you are. Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
And that's what I provide for my students on the very first day, that this class is a sacred space. And then I set out to prove that to them. And one of the ways I prove that to them is I tell them I don't care about your grades. What I do care about is you as a person. And how I prove it is I want to be able to provide you with a letter of recommendation. And in order to provide you with that letter of recommendation, I need to get to know who you are as a person. So you need to be able to stand out to me. So at the end of this class, I will be able to say to a future employer or a future recommendation for graduate school or for your doctoral program, I know exactly who you are. So your sacredness has to shine through to me so I can give it to somebody else. So this sacredness has to grow between you and me. I provide a sacred space. That's how I teach, and that's what's important. So now we're going to open it up to questions. I'm going to stop sharing. Is that okay?